A slave woman with starving twins whispered, "Please, we're so hungry, help us." The Modoc scout knelt in the dust and said, "I'll feed you all. Come with me." Redstone Valley, California Territory, March 1873. The sun hung low and merciless over the dried earth, baking the ground until it cracked like old pottery. Heat shimmered in waves across the valley floor, distorting the distant mountains into wavering ghosts. This was land that took more than it gave, land that swallowed hope and spat back dust. The town of Redstone sat in the valley's heart, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single dirt road. Saloons, a general store, a livery stable, and at the far edge where respectability ended, a row of shanties where those deemed unworthy made their homes. In the last shanty, barely more than 4 walls and a sagging roof, Esther Mae Whitlow knelt on the dirt floor beside her children. Jonah and Mercy, 4 years old, twins born in bondage 3 states away, lay curled together on a thin blanket. Their bellies were hollow, their eyes too large in their small faces. They had not eaten in 3 days. The last of the cornmeal was gone, scraped from the bottom of a tin that had been nearly empty to begin with. Esther was 26, but looked older. Her hands were calloused from years of labor. Her back bore scars she never spoke of, and her face carried the weariness of a woman who had survived what should have broken her. She had been property once, owned by a ranch family in Texas until the war changed everything. Freedom came with papers she could not read, signed by men who did not care what happened after. She had walked west with her children, following rumors of work, of charity, of anything. Instead, she found Redstone, where freedom meant the right to starve without a master. She worked when she could, washing clothes in the creek, mending torn shirts for men who paid her in crusts of bread or coins, so few they vanished before they warmed her palm. But work was scarce, and charity scarcer. The people of Redstone had their own troubles. They did not spare much thought for a black woman and her children living in a shack at the edge of town. Most days, they looked right through her as if she were smoke, something temporary and insubstantial, something the wind would eventually carry away. The shanty they called home had been abandoned when they arrived 6 months ago. The previous occupant, an old prospector who died alone, had left nothing but broken furniture and the lingering smell of tobacco. Esther had swept it clean, patched the holes in the walls with scraps of wood she found, and made it livable. The roof leaked when it rained, and the wind whistled through gaps in the boards, but it was shelter. It was something. In a world that offered her nothing, even a leaking roof felt like grace. That morning, Esther had tried. She had walked to the general store with Jonah and Mercy trailing behind her, their small hands clutching her skirt. The storekeeper, a thick-necked man named Horace Drummond, stood behind his counter sorting through invoices. His store was the largest building in town, stocked with goods brought in by wagon from Sacramento. Sacks of flour and sugar, crates of canned goods, bolts of fabric, tools, ammunition, everything a frontier town needed. The smell of coffee and leather and sawdust filled the air, and Esther's stomach twisted with hunger as she stepped inside. She approached slowly, head slightly bowed, voice quiet. "Mr. Drummond, sir, I was wondering if you might have any work. Sweeping, stacking, anything at all. I can work hard, and I won't ask for much." Her voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. She had practiced these words in her mind all morning, rehearsing them until they sounded humble enough, grateful enough, unthreatening enough. Drummond did not look up. He continued shuffling papers, his thick fingers moving with deliberate slowness. "Got no work for you," he said flatly. "Got all the help I need." His voice carried no malice, just indifference, which somehow felt worse. Esther swallowed hard. Behind her, she could feel other customers watching, their eyes boring into her back. A woman in a clean calico dress shifted her basket to the other arm and turned away. A man in dusty work clothes snorted quietly and muttered something under his breath. "Please, sir, Esther continued, her voice quieter now. My children haven't eaten in days. Just a little flour, maybe some beans. I can pay you back when I find work. I give you my word. The moment the words left her mouth, she knew they were worthless. What was the word of a former slave worth? In a place like this? What promises could she make that anyone would believe? Now Drummond looked up, his eyes cold and dismissive. You think I'm running a charity? You want something, you pay for it. No money, no goods. That's how it works. He gestured toward the door with a flick of his hand. Now move along. You're blocking my customers. He turned his back on her, signaling the conversation was over. Behind the counter, a younger clerk smirked and whispered something to another man, and they both laughed. Esther stood there for a moment, her throat tight, shame burning in her chest like hot coals. Her children's hands gripped her skirt harder, and she could feel Mercy beginning to tremble. Then she turned and walked out, her head high despite everything, refusing to let them see her break. Outside, the heat struck her like a physical blow. The sun seemed to press down on her shoulders, heavy and relentless. Mercy began to cry softly, tears carving clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. Jonah, trying to be brave the way he always did, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and bit his lip to keep from sobbing. Esther knelt down and pulled them both close, wrapping her arms around their small bodies. It's all right, she whispered, her voice cracking. We'll be all right. Mama's going to figure something out. But even as she said it, she did not know if she believed it anymore. She had been figuring things out for months, and every solution led to another dead end. Every promise of work vanished like smoke. Every door closed before she could knock. They walked back through the center of town, passing men on horseback, women in clean dresses, children with full bellies playing in the street. A group of boys chased a hoop down the road, their laughter bright and carefree. Outside the saloon, men sat on benches, smoking and talking, their voices low and easy. No one met Esther's eyes. No one spoke. They were ghosts moving through a world that had no place for them, invisible except when someone wanted to remind them of their place. When they reached the edge of town, near the old water trough where travelers stopped to rest their horses, Esther paused. Her legs felt weak, her vision swam, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. She leaned against the trough, gripping its rough wooden edge, forcing herself to breathe slowly. Jonah and Mercy stood beside her, silent now, their eyes dull with exhaustion. That was when she saw him. He stood in the shadow of a cottonwood tree across the road, tall and still, watching the street with the quiet intensity of someone who saw everything and judged little. His skin was the color of burnished copper, his hair long and black, tied back with a strip of leather. He wore simple clothes, a worn shirt the color of dried clay, canvas trousers patched at the knees, and moccasins stitched with intricate patterns. A rifle rested against the tree beside him, and a knife in a beaded sheath hung at his belt, but it was his eyes that held her. Dark, deep, and filled with something she had not seen in a long time. Not pity, which she had grown to hate, but compassion. Real compassion. The kind that moved a person to action rather than words. He had been watching her, she realized. Watching her leave the store, watching her struggle, watching her children stumble through the dust. And unlike everyone else in this town, he had not looked away. Esther did not mean to stop. She did not mean to stare. But exhaustion and desperation had worn her down to nothing, and when Mercy stumbled, falling to her knees in the dust, Esther felt something inside her break. She knelt beside her daughter, trying to lift her, but her own strength was failing. Mercy was so light, too light, her little body nothing but bones wrapped in thin cotton. Jonah sat down in the dirt beside his sister, too tired to stand, his head drooping forward, and then before she could stop herself, before pride or fear or shame could hold her back, Esther whispered the words she had been holding back for days. Please, we're so hungry. Help us. Her voice was barely audible, swallowed by the wind and the noise of the town. She did not know if anyone heard. She did not know if anyone cared. She had stopped expecting miracles, but then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. She looked up through the blur of tears and saw the man from the cottonwood tree standing before her. He did not speak at first. He simply knelt down in the dust beside her, his movements careful, deliberate, as though approaching something fragile and frightened. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, she saw no pity, no judgment, no disgust. Only resolve. "I'll feed you all," he said quietly. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but kind. Each word carried weight, as if he understood the gravity of what he was offering. "Come with me." He did not demand, did not command. He simply offered, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Esther stared at him, unable to move. Her mind raced with every lesson she had learned since gaining her freedom. Strangers did not help without reason. Strangers took. They demanded payment in ways that left scars deeper than any whip. They used and discarded. Trust was a luxury she could not afford. But this man, this Modoc man whose name she did not know, simply waited. He did not rush her. He did not grab her children. He did not threaten or cajole. He simply offered his hand, palm up, waiting for her to decide. "My name is Cannon," he said, his voice soft. "I have food. I have shelter. You and your children will not go hungry tonight." His hand remained extended, steady and sure, weathered and scarred but gentle. Esther looked at Jonah and Mercy, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes pleading without words. She looked back at Cannon, searching his face for lies, for traps, for anything that would tell her this was another cruelty disguised as kindness. But she found none. Only patience and something that looked almost like understanding. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, calloused from work, but careful not to hurt. When he helped her to her feet, she felt something she had not felt in years, something she thought had died somewhere on the long road west. Hope. Cannon lifted Mercy into his arms without asking permission, cradling her gently against his chest as if she were made of glass. The little girl did not resist. She simply laid her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. Jonah clung to Esther's hand, his small fingers wrapped tight around hers, and together they followed this stranger away from the town that had turned its back on them. They walked in silence, moving past the last of the buildings and into the open land beyond. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the valley. The mountains in the distance turned purple and gold, and the air began to cool. Esther's legs trembled with every step, her body screaming for rest, but she kept moving. She had no choice. She had nothing left but this one fragile thread of trust, this one desperate gamble that maybe, just maybe, Cannon was different from everyone else. After a mile, the terrain changed. They left the open valley and entered a grove of oak trees, ancient and gnarled, their branches spreading wide to create pockets of shade. A creek ran through the grove, its water clear and cold, burbling over smooth stones. Birds sang in the branches, and the air smelled of earth and green things. It was a world apart from the dust and heat of Redstone. Cannon's camp was simple but well made. A lean-to constructed of branches and canvas stood against a hillside, angled to catch the morning sun. A fire pit ringed with stones held the remnants of a morning fire, ash and charred wood. Nearby, a saddle rested on a fallen log, and beside it, neatly organized supplies, a bedroll, cooking pots, saddlebags, tools. Everything had its place. Everything spoke of a man who lived deliberately, carefully, alone but not careless. Cannon set Mercy down gently on a blanket near the fire pit and gestured for Esther and Jonah to sit. Mercy curled up immediately, too exhausted to keep her eyes open. Jonah sat beside his mother, leaning against her side. Esther watched Cannon, her body tense, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for him to reveal what he wanted in return. But he simply began to work. He built up the fire with practiced efficiency, arranging dry grass and small twigs in a cone, striking flint against steel until sparks caught and flames flickered to life. He fed the fire carefully, adding larger sticks, then split logs, coaxing it into a steady blaze. From a saddlebag hanging from a tree branch, he pulled out strips of dried venison, dark and marbled with fat, a small sack of cornmeal tied with twine, and a tin of beans. He moved with quiet competence, every action deliberate and sure. He filled a pot with water from the creek, the cold liquid sloshing as he carried it back to the fire. He set it over the flames on a metal grate and added the beans and venison, stirring them together. From a leather pouch at his belt, he pulled out salt, dried herbs, and something that looked like wild onion. The smell that began to rise from the pot was almost painful in its richness, savory and warm and utterly intoxicating. Esther's mouth watered uncontrollably. Beside her, she heard Jonah's stomach growl, a sound so loud it echoed in the quiet grove. Cannon worked in silence, stirring the pot occasionally, adding a pinch of this or that, tasting from a wooden spoon and nodding to himself. When the food was ready, thick and steaming, he ladled it into 3 tin bowls and handed one to each of them. Esther took hers with trembling hands, the heat of the metal almost burning her palms. She looked at Cannon, waiting for him to name his price, to tell her what he expected. But he simply nodded toward the bowl and said one word. "Eat," she did. The first bite was almost overwhelming, an explosion of flavor and warmth that made her eyes water. The beans were tender, the venison rich and smoky, the broth seasoned perfectly. She had forgotten what it felt like to eat something that tasted like more than mere survival, something made with care and intention. Jonah and Mercy ate with frantic hunger at first, scooping beans into their mouths with their fingers, chewing the venison with tears streaming down their faces, their bodies shaking with relief when they finished. Cannon refilled their bowls without a word, ladling more stew until the pot was nearly empty. This time they ate more slowly, savoring each bite, their bodies beginning to remember what fullness felt like. When they were finally done, truly full for the first time in weeks, Esther set her bowl down and looked at Cannon. He sat across the fire from them, his own bowl still untouched in his hands, watching them with quiet satisfaction. "Why?" Esther asked, her voice hoarse and raw with emotion. "Why would you help us? You don't know us. We have nothing to give you." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with all the fear and suspicion she had carried for so long. Cannon looked into the fire for a long moment before answering, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. "I know what it is to be hungry," he said simply, his voice low and steady. "I know what it is to be forgotten, to be treated as less than human because of the blood in your veins." He paused, his jaw tightening. "My people were driven from their lands, hunted, killed, scattered. I have watched children starve. I have buried friends who died because no one cared enough to help." He met her eyes across the fire. "No one should have to beg for mercy in a land that claims to be free." Esther felt tears burn her eyes, hot and unstoppable, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough in her life. She had cried when they took her children from her arms to sell them, cried when the war ended but freedom brought no relief, cried on the long walk west when she thought they would all die on the road. She did not want to cry now. But the tears came anyway, silent and slow. "Thank you," she whispered, the words utterly inadequate for what he had given them. Cannon nodded once, his expression softening. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes next. But for now, rest. You're safe." He stood and added more wood to the fire, then retrieved blankets from his supplies and spread them out under the lean-to. That night, Esther lay beside her children under the shelter, wrapped in wool blankets that smelled of wood smoke and sage. The canvas above them blocked the wind, and the fire burned steady and warm. Jonah and Mercy slept deeply for the first time in weeks, their breathing even and peaceful, their bellies full, their bodies finally allowed to rest. Esther listened to them breathe, her hand resting on Mercy's back, feeling the rise and fall. She glanced across the fire and saw Cannon sitting with his back against an oak tree, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the camp. He did not sleep. He simply watched, silent and vigilant, a guardian she had not asked for but desperately needed. The fire cast shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the scar that ran along his jawline, the weariness in his eyes that matched her own. And in that moment, Esther understood something profound. Kindness was not weakness. Strength was not always loud or violent or cruel. Sometimes salvation came quietly, in the form of a stranger who knelt in the dust and offered his hand without asking for anything in return. Sometimes humanity survived in the most unexpected places, carried by those who had every reason to harden their hearts, but chose compassion instead. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The stars wheeled overhead, vast and indifferent, the same stars that had watched empires rise and fall, that had seen every human cruelty and every human kindness. And beneath them, in a small camp hidden in an oak grove, a mother and her children slept without fear for the first time in a very long time. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own uncertainties. But tonight, they were safe. Tonight, they were fed. And tonight, that was enough. Morning came softly to the oak grove, light filtering through the branches in golden shafts that turned the air hazy and dreamlike. Esther woke to the sound of the creek bubbling over stones and the smell of coffee brewing over a rebuilt fire. For a moment, still caught between sleep and waking, she forgot where she was. Then memory returned, the hunger, the town, the stranger who had fed them, and she sat up quickly, her heart racing. Jonah and Mercy still slept beside her, curled together like puppies, their faces peaceful in a way she had not seen in months. She studied them in the early light, noticing details hunger had made her too frantic to see before. Jonah's hair needed cutting, wild curls falling into his eyes. Mercy's dress was more patches than original fabric, held together by Esther's careful stitching. But they were breathing. They were alive. And that was more than she had dared hope for yesterday. Cannon sat by the fire, pouring coffee from a battered pot into a tin cup. He had been awake for hours, she realized. The camp showed signs of morning work, fresh wood stacked near the fire, the water bucket filled, his gear organized and ready. He glanced up as she emerged from the lean-to and offered her the cup without a word. She took it, the heat seeping into her palms, and sipped carefully. It was strong and bitter and perfect. "Thank you," she said quietly, "not just for the coffee but for everything." Cannon nodded and poured another cup for himself. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the morning sounds of the grove, birds calling to each other, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the endless murmur of the creek. It was the most peaceful moment Esther had experienced since leaving Texas. "You cannot go back to that town," Cannon said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was matter-of-fact, not unkind but firm. "They will not help you. They have made that clear." Esther stared into her coffee, knowing he was right, but not knowing what else to do. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted. "No money, no family, no prospects. Redstone was supposed to be a fresh start, but it turned out to be just another place that does not want us." Cannon was quiet for a moment, then stood and walked to his saddlebags. He returned with a piece of paper, worn and creased from being folded and unfolded many times. He handed it to Esther. She looked at it, recognizing it as some kind of map, hand-drawn with careful detail. "There is a settlement," Cannon said, pointing to a spot marked with an X. 2 days' ride north of here, in the foothills. It is small, maybe 30 people. They call it Clearwater. The people there are different, Modoc, Paiute, some whites who were cast out from other places, former slaves like yourself. They do not turn away those who need help. Esther studied the map, her heart beginning to beat faster. Why would they take us in? We have nothing to offer. Cannon met her eyes. They do not measure worth the way Redstone does. They measure it in willingness to work, to share, to be part of something. If you are willing to contribute what you can, they will welcome you. He paused. I can take you there. It is not an easy journey, but it is possible. Esther felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. When could we leave? She asked. Tomorrow, Cannon replied. Today you rest. You and your children need to regain your strength. Tomorrow, at first light, we ride. He stood and moved to the fire, beginning to prepare breakfast. But first, you eat again. And then we prepare. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Cannon proved to be not just a provider but a teacher. After they ate, a simple meal of fried cornmeal cakes and more of the venison, he showed Esther how to identify edible plants in the grove. He knelt beside a cluster of low-growing greens and pulled up a handful, shaking the dirt from the roots. Miner's lettuce, he said. Good raw or cooked. Grows near water. You can eat the leaves and stems. He pointed to another plant with narrow leaves. Wild onion. Adds flavor to anything. Pull from the base. Esther followed him through the grove. Jonah and Mercy trailing behind, their energy slowly returning now that they had food in their bellies. Cannon moved through the landscape with an ease that spoke of deep familiarity, reading the land the way Esther once read the faces of those who owned her, looking for signs of danger or opportunity. He showed them which berries were safe, which mushrooms to avoid, how to find water by watching where birds flew at dawn. The land provides, he said as they worked, if you know how to listen. Most people in towns like Redstone have forgotten that. They think survival comes from coins and stores and relying on others who do not care if they live or die. But out here, if you pay attention, the earth gives what you need. He straightened, looking at the children. You must learn this. All of you. Because no one else will teach you, and someday it may save your lives. By midday, they had gathered enough greens and roots to supplement their supplies. Cannon taught Esther how to build a fire properly, not the desperate, smoky affairs she had made in the shanty, but a clean, hot fire that burned efficiently and left little trace. He showed her how to bank it for slow cooking, how to use green wood to create smoke for signaling, how to extinguish it completely so no embers remain to start a wildfire. Jonah watched everything with intense concentration, his young mind soaking up each lesson like parched earth drinking rain. When Cannon demonstrated how to sharpen a knife on a whetstone, Jonah crept closer, his eyes wide. Can I try? He asked shyly. Cannon considered him for a moment, then nodded and handed him a small blade, keeping his own hands close in case the boy fumbled. Hold it at this angle, he instructed. Long, steady strokes. Let the stone do the work, not your strength. Jonah followed the instructions carefully, his small hands gripping the knife with fierce determination. The scrape of metal on stone filled the quiet afternoon. After several minutes, Cannon took the blade back and tested it against his thumb. Good, he said simply, and Jonah's face lit up with pride. It was the first time Esther had seen him smile, really smile, since they left Texas. While Jonah worked with Cannon, Mercy stayed close to Esther, helping to sort through the gathered plants and wash them in the creek. The little girl was quieter than her brother, more watchful, as if she understood on some instinctive level that the world was dangerous and required constant vigilance. But here, in the safety of the grove, she began to relax. She laughed when a frog jumped out from under a rock, squealed when she splashed cold water on her own face, hummed tunelessly as she worked. That afternoon, As the sun reached its peak and the heat grew oppressive even in the shade, Cannon led them to a deeper part of the creek where the water pooled in a natural basin. "You should bathe," he said to Esther. "The water is clean and cold. It will help." He gestured upstream. "I will be up there, keeping watch. Take your time." Then he walked away, giving them privacy without being asked. Esther helped Jonah and Mercy into the water, watching them splash and play, washing away layers of dust and grime that had accumulated over weeks of living in the shanty. She scrubbed their skin gently, working soap she had carried from Texas, a precious luxury she had been hoarding, through their hair and over their thin limbs. When they were clean, she sent them to sit on the bank in the sun to dry and waded deeper into the pool herself. The cold water shocked her system, driving away the fog of exhaustion that had clung to her for so long. She ducked under completely, holding her breath, feeling the current tug at her hair and clothes. When she surfaced, gasping, she felt something shift inside her.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The constant knot of fear in her stomach loosened just slightly. The weight on her shoulders lifted just enough to let her breathe fully. She floated on her back, staring up at the sky through the canopy of leaves. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to imagine a future that did not involve constant hunger, constant fear, constant struggle. Maybe Clearwater would be different. Maybe they could build something there. Maybe, just maybe, they had finally found someone who would help them not out of pity or obligation, but because it was simply the right thing to do. When they returned to camp, clean and refreshed, Cannon had laid out supplies on a blanket. A bedroll, a canvas tarp, a cooking pot, a canteen, dried food wrapped in cloth. "For the journey," he explained. "We travel light, but we travel prepared. Tomorrow morning, before the sun rises, we leave. The first day will be hard. The children will need to ride." "Do they know horses?" Esther shook her head. "They have never been near one." Cannon nodded as if he had expected this answer. "Then today they learn." He walked to where his horse was picketed in a patch of grass near the creek, a sturdy mare with a dark coat and intelligent eyes. She raised her head as he approached, nickering softly. He stroked her neck and spoke to her in a language Esther did not understand, low and melodic, then gestured for the children to come closer. Jonah approached cautiously, Mercy hiding behind him. The horse was massive to their young eyes, a creature of power and potential danger. But Cannon showed them how to approach slowly, hand extended, letting the mare sniff their scent. "Her name is Talasi," he said. "It means cornflower in my language. She is gentle, but you must be gentle with her. No sudden movements. No loud noises. Speak softly and move slowly." He lifted Jonah onto the mare's back, steadying him with strong hands. The boy's eyes went wide with fear and wonder, his small hands gripping the mane. Cannon led the horse in a slow walk around the clearing, speaking quietly to both child and animal. After a few minutes, Jonah's grip loosened and he began to smile. "I am flying," he whispered. "I am flying, Mama." Mercy went next, more hesitant but just as eager once she was seated. Cannon walked the horse in wider circles, teaching them how to sit, how to hold on, how to move with the animal's rhythm rather than fighting against it. By the time the sun began to set, both children were comfortable enough to sit on the horse while it stood still, petting Talasi's neck and talking to her in soft voices. That evening, as twilight settled over the grove and the first stars appeared, they ate together around the fire. Cannon had made a stew from the plants they gathered, adding more venison and some wild herbs that gave it a rich, earthy flavor. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes when words are unnecessary, when presence alone is enough. After the meal, Cannon pulled out a piece of wood and his knife and began to whittle. The children watched, fascinated, as his hands worked the blade with practiced ease, shaving away curls of wood that fell like snow around his feet. Slowly, a shape emerged, a bird with outstretched wings. When he finished, he handed it to Mercy. "For you," he said, "to remember that even small things can fly if they are brave enough." Mercy held the wooden bird with both hands, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she whispered. Cannon nodded and began another piece, this time carving what looked like a running horse. He worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of the blade and the crackling fire. When he finished, he gave it to Jonah. "For you. To remember that strength comes not from size, but from heart." Esther watched this exchange, her throat tight with emotion. This man, this stranger who owed them nothing, was giving her children more than food and shelter. He was giving them dignity. He was giving them hope. He was showing them that kindness still existed in a world that had taught them only cruelty. Later, after the children had fallen asleep under the lean-to, Esther and Cannon sat by the dying fire. The night was cool, the stars brilliant overhead. For a long time neither spoke. Then Esther found her voice. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. "The truth. Not the answer you gave before, but the real reason. What drives a man to risk everything for strangers?" Cannon stared into the embers, his face unreadable in the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean closer to hear. "I had a daughter once," he said. "She was 6 years old when the soldiers came to our village. They said we had to leave our land, that it belonged to settlers now. We refused. We had lived there for generations. It was sacred ground, the burial place of our ancestors." He paused, his jaw working. "They came at dawn. Set fire to everything. My wife ran with our daughter, trying to reach the forest. I was fighting, trying to hold them back. I saw her fall. Saw the smoke take them both. By the time I reached them, it was too late." His hands clenched into fists. "I carried my daughter's body for 3 days, looking for a place to bury her that the soldiers would not desecrate. I found a place high in the mountains, near a waterfall. I buried her there and carved her name into a stone." Esther felt tears streaming down her face, but she did not wipe them away. "I am so sorry," she whispered. Cannon shook his head. "After that, I wandered. I did not care if I lived or died. I took work where I could find it, scouting for wagon trains, hunting, anything to keep moving. But everywhere I went, I saw children suffering. Children starving. Children dying because the adults around them had failed. And every time I saw it, I saw my daughter's face." He turned to look at Esther, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I could not save her. But maybe I can save others. Maybe that is why I am still here. To stand between the innocent and the cruelty of this world, even if only for a moment. Even if it changes nothing in the end." He looked away. "When I saw you in that town, saw your children hungry and the people walking past as if you were invisible, I knew I could not do the same. I could not be one more person who turned away." Esther reached out and placed her hand over his. "You are a good man, Cannon, better than most I have known." He did not pull away, but he did not respond either. They sat like that for a long time, two people bound together by loss and survival. By the understanding that sometimes the only way to heal your own wounds is to prevent others from suffering the same. The fire burned down to ash. The stars wheeled overhead. And in the morning, they would begin the journey to Clearwater, to a place that might finally offer refuge. But tonight, in this moment, they simply sat together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other's presence. Two souls who had been broken by the world but refused to let it break them completely. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry echoing through the hills. Talasi shifted in her sleep, and the creek murmured its endless song. The night pressed close, vast and unknowable, but here in their small circle of firelight, they were safe. And for now, that was all that mattered. They left before dawn, when the world was still wrapped in darkness, and the air carried the bite of mountain cold. Cannon woke them gently, his hand on Esther's shoulder, his voice barely a whisper so as not to startle the children. The camp had already been dismantled, everything packed with military efficiency onto Thalasi's back, and a second horse, Cannon, had retrieved from somewhere during the night. A smaller paint mare he called Nizoni. Esther helped dress Jonah and Mercy in the dim light of a shielded lantern, wrapping them in blankets Cannon provided and making sure their shoes were tied tight. The children were quiet, sensing the seriousness of the moment, understanding without being told that this journey would determine everything. Cannon handed Esther a piece of dried meat and a handful of berries. "Eat while we walk," he said. "We have distance to cover before the sun gets high." He lifted Mercy onto Thalasi, settling her in front of the saddle where she could hold the horn, then placed Jonah behind her with instructions to hold his sister around the waist. Esther walked alongside, one hand resting on Mercy's leg, while Cannon led both horses by their reins. They moved through the grove in single file, their footsteps muffled by pine needles and soft earth, and emerged onto a narrow trail that wound north into the foothills. The first hour passed in silence, broken only by the creak of leather, the soft footfalls of the horses, and the gradual awakening of the land around them. Birds began their morning songs, tentative at first, then building into a chorus that seemed to celebrate the rising sun. The sky lightened from black to deep purple to pink, and finally the sun broke over the eastern mountains, flooding the valley below with golden light. The trail climbed steadily, leaving the oak groves behind and entering territory dominated by pine and scrub brush. The air grew thinner, cleaner, carrying the scent of sage and resin. Cannon set a pace that was steady but not punishing, stopping every hour to let the horses rest and to check on the children. During these breaks, he would scan the horizon with eyes that missed nothing, looking for signs of danger, other travelers, smoke, dust clouds, anything that might indicate trouble ahead. By mid-morning, they had climbed high enough that Redstone was visible far below, a collection of brown buildings that looked insignificant against the vast landscape. Esther stood at the edge of a rocky overlook and stared down at the town that had rejected them. From this height, it seemed impossible that such a small place could hold so much cruelty, so much indifference. She thought of the shanty they had left behind, the empty tin that had once held cornmeal, the thin blanket the children had shared. All of it felt like another lifetime now. "Do not look back," Cannon said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "That place does not deserve your thoughts. Only forward now." He pointed to the north, where the mountains rose in successive ridges, each one higher and more imposing than the last. "Clearwater lies beyond the third ridge. We will reach it by tomorrow evening if we keep this pace and the weather holds." They continued climbing. The trail grew rockier, more treacherous, and Cannon dismounted to lead the horses more carefully over sections where a misplaced hoof could mean disaster. Esther walked close behind, her eyes on the children, ready to catch them if they slipped. But Jonah and Mercy proved more resilient than she had expected, sitting straight and alert, their small hands gripping the saddle, their faces set with determination. Around noon, they reached a plateau where a natural spring bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks and formed a small pool before trickling away down the mountainside. Cannon called a halt and helped the children down from the horses. "We rest here," he said. "Eat, drink, stretch your legs. The afternoon will be harder." While the horses drank from the pool, he unpacked food from the saddlebags, more dried venison, hard biscuits, and some kind of pressed fruitcake that was dense and sweet. They sat in the shade of a large boulder, eating slowly, watching hawks circle in the thermals above. Jonah asked questions about everything, wanting to know the names of the birds, the plants, the distant peaks. Cannon answered each question patiently, teaching as they rested. "That is a red-tailed hawk," he said, pointing to one of the circling birds. "See the russet color on the tail when it turns? They hunt rabbits and ground squirrels. If you see them diving, you know prey is near." Mercy was quieter, but Esther noticed her watching Cannon with an intensity that went beyond mere curiosity. The little girl had taken to following him everywhere when they were in camp, mimicking his movements, trying to help with whatever task he performed. Now she sat pressed against his side, her small hand resting on his arm, as if anchoring herself to his presence. Cannon did not seem to mind. He adjusted his position slightly to make her more comfortable and continued talking to Jonah about the landscape. After an hour, they resumed the journey. The trail descended into a narrow canyon where the walls rose sheer on either side, and the path was barely wide enough for the horses to pass single file. The air here was cooler, shaded from the sun, and sound echoed strangely off the rock faces. Water had carved the canyon over countless years, leaving smooth curves and strange formations that looked almost intentional, like sculptures left by ancient hands. Halfway through the canyon, Cannon stopped abruptly and raised his hand for silence. Esther froze, her heart suddenly racing. She heard it then, voices echoing from somewhere ahead, rough and loud, the unmistakable sound of men who had been drinking. Cannon's expression hardened. He turned to Lassie around quickly and motioned for Esther to follow him back the way they had come, but it was too late. 3 men on horseback emerged from around a bend in the canyon, blocking the path ahead. They wore the rough clothes of prospectors or drifters, their faces unshaven, their eyes hard and calculating. The one in front, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, grinned when he saw them. "Well now," he said, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "What do we have here?" "An Indian and his little family trying to sneak through our canyon." Cannon said nothing. He positioned Talassi between the men and Esther, his hand moving slowly toward the rifle strapped to his saddle. The scarred man noticed and laughed. "Easy there, Chief. We are not looking for trouble. We are just curious about what you are carrying in those packs. Looks like you are loaded pretty heavy for a traveling party." One of the other men, younger with a patchy beard, edged his horse closer to Najoni. "And that is a fine horse you got there. Paint mare like that is worth good money. Maybe you would consider a trade?" His eyes slid to Esther and the children, and his grin widened. "Or maybe we can work out some other arrangement." Esther felt ice flood her veins. She recognized that look, had seen it on the faces of men her whole life. The look that said she was not a person, but property, something to be used and discarded. She pulled Jonah closer to her side and moved to shield both children with her body. Cannon's voice, when he spoke, was cold and level. "You will let us pass. We have no quarrel with you, and you have no business with us. Move aside." The scarred man laughed again, but there was no humor in it. "I do not think you understand how this works, Chief. This here is our canyon. We charge a toll for passage. Now you can pay that toll with supplies, with horses, or with whatever else you got that we might want. Or we can just take it all and leave you walking. Your choice." Time seemed to slow. Esther saw Cannon's shoulders tense, saw his hand inch closer to the rifle. She saw the 3 men spread out slightly, positioning themselves to attack from multiple angles. She saw Jonah's terrified face, Mercy's wide eyes. And in that moment, she understood with crystal clarity that violence was coming, that there was no way to talk their way out of this, that these men had already decided what they would take. Cannon moved first. In one fluid motion, he pulled the rifle from its scabbard, levered around into the chamber, and fired. The shot cracked like thunder in the narrow canyon, and the scarred man's hat flew off his head, a neat hole punched through the crown. The man yelped and jerked his horse backward, his hand going to his head to check for blood. "Next one does not miss," Cannon said, his voice deadly calm. "I have 7 more rounds, and I do not miss twice. You want to test that, or do you want to ride away and live to see sunset?" For a long moment, nobody moved. The 3 men stared at Cannon, reassessing, calculating odds. Then the youngest one, the one with the patchy beard, slowly raised his hands. "Easy, friend. We were just having a bit of fun. No harm meant." He backed his horse away, and after a moment, the other 2 followed. The scarred man pointed a finger at Cannon, his face twisted with rage. "You just made a mistake, Indian. A big one. We will remember you." "Good," Cannon replied. "Remember that I let you live. And be grateful." He kept the rifle trained on them until they rounded the bend and disappeared. Even then, he did not lower the weapon. He waited, listening, until the sound of their horses faded completely. Only then did he exhale and turn to Esther. "Are you hurt? The children?" She shook her head, unable to speak. Her whole body was trembling with adrenaline and fear. Cannon dismounted and walked to where she stood, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Breathe," he said quietly. "It is over. They will not come back." Esther nodded, forcing herself to take deep breaths, to calm the panic threatening to overwhelm her. Beside her, Jonah was crying silently, his face pressed against her side. Mercy sat frozen on Talassi's back, her small hands white-knuckled on the saddle horn. Cannon lifted Mercy down and held her for a moment, speaking to her in his own language, his voice soft and soothing. Whatever he said seemed to work because the rigidity left her small body, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He carried her like that as they continued through the canyon, moving quickly now, wanting to put distance between themselves and the place of confrontation. They emerged from the canyon into an open valley as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The land here was different, greener, with tall grass swaying in the wind and clusters of wildflowers painting the hillsides in purple and yellow. A river wound through the center of the valley, its water clear and fast-moving, fed by snowmelt from the mountains above. It was beautiful in a way that made Esther's chest ache. Cannon chose a campsite near the river, tucked against a rock outcropping that would shield them from view and provide protection from the wind. He worked quickly to set up camp, building a fire, unpacking supplies, tending to the horses. But Esther noticed that he kept the rifle close at hand and frequently paused to scan the surrounding hills. The encounter in the canyon had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. That evening, as they ate a sparse meal of beans and biscuits, the children were unusually quiet. The fear from the afternoon still lingered, casting a shadow over what should have been a pleasant camp in a beautiful location. Esther tried to draw them into conversation, asking about what they had seen during the day's journey, but their responses were monosyllabic, distracted. Finally, Jonah spoke up, his voice small. "Are those men going to find us?" Cannon set down his bowl and looked at the boy seriously. "No," he said with absolute conviction. "They are cowards who prey on those they think are weak. They will not follow us into the high country. And if they did, they would regret it." He paused. "I know you were frightened today. That is natural. But I want you to understand something. As long as I am with you, I will let no harm come to your family. Do you believe me?" Jonah studied Cannon's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you." Mercy, who had been sitting close to Esther, suddenly got up and walked over to Cannon, climbing into his lap without asking permission. She nestled against his chest and closed her eyes. Cannon looked surprised, then his expression softened. He wrapped one arm around her small body and continued eating with the other hand. Later, after the children had fallen asleep, Esther and Cannon sat by the fire as they had the night before. But tonight the silence between them felt different, heavier, weighted with things unsaid. Finally, Esther found her voice. "You could have killed those men." I saw it in your eyes. You wanted to. Why did you not? Cannon stared into the flames for a long time before answering. Because killing is easy, he said quietly. Any fool with a gun can take a life. But once you start down that path, once you decide that violence is the solution to every problem, it changes you. It hollows you out until there is nothing left but rage and regret. He paused. I have killed before. In war, in defense of my people. I carry those deaths with me every day. I see their faces in my dreams. I do not want to add more ghosts to that company unless there is no other choice. Esther reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. You are a better man than most I have known. You know that, do you not? Cannon shook his head. I am just a man trying to do what is right in a world that makes it very difficult. Nothing more. But Esther saw through the deflection. Saw the weight of responsibility he carried. The burden of trying to protect others while still carrying his own unhealed wounds. They sat together in the firelight. Hands clasped, drawing strength from each other. Above them, the stars emerged one by one, filling the sky with cold light. The river sang its endless song, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called. Tomorrow they would reach Clearwater. Tomorrow their lives might finally begin to change for the better. But tonight, in this moment, they simply held on to each other, two broken people becoming something stronger together. The fire burned low. The night deepened. And in the shelter of the rock outcropping, a new family slept. Bound not by blood, but by something more enduring. The choice to stand together against whatever the world might bring. The storm came without warning, rolling over the mountains like divine wrath made visible. One moment the sky was clear, bright blue stretching endlessly overhead, and the next, dark clouds boiled up from behind the western peaks, blotting out the sun and turning midday to twilight. The temperature dropped so rapidly that Esther could see her breath misting in the air. And the wind picked up until it howled through the valley like something alive and furious. They had been traveling since dawn, making good time on a trail that followed the river upstream toward the final ridge before Clearwater. Cannon had been in good spirits, pointing out landmarks and telling the children they would reach the settlement by nightfall. But now his expression turned grim as he studied the approaching storm. We need shelter, he said, raising his voice over the growing wind. Now, this is going to be bad. He urged the horses into a faster pace, scanning the rocky hillsides for anything that might provide protection. Rain began to fall, light at first, then harder, then in sheets so thick Esther could barely see 10 feet ahead. Within minutes they were all soaked through, water streaming down their faces, turning the trail into a river of mud. The children clung to Talasi's saddle, their faces pale with cold and fear. Their small bodies shaking, lightning split the sky. So close the thunder came simultaneously, a crack that made the horses shy and nearly threw Jonah from his seat. Cannon grabbed the boy with one hand while controlling Talasi with the other, his strength keeping them all together. There, he shouted, pointing toward an outcropping of rock halfway up the hillside. A cave, we make for that. The climb was treacherous. The horses struggled in the mud, their hooves slipping, their eyes rolling white with fear. Esther pushed from behind, her hands on Njoni's hindquarters, lending what little strength she had. The rain was so cold, it felt like needles against her skin, and her dress clung to her body like a second skin of ice. She could not feel her fingers, could not feel her feet, could only keep moving forward because stopping meant death. They reached the cave mouth just as hail began to fall. Chunks of ice the size of walnuts bouncing off the rocks and striking them with bruising force. Cannon pulled the horses inside first, then reached back for Esther, dragging her into the shelter. She collapsed on the stone floor, gasping, while he went back for the children. He lifted Mercy down, then Jonah, carrying them both inside and setting them against the back wall of the cave where the floor was dry, The cave was not large. Perhaps 15 feet deep and 8 feet wide, but it was enough. The ceiling was high enough that Cannon could stand upright, and the opening faced away from the wind, providing protection from the worst of the storm. Outside, the world had turned into chaos. Rain and hail hammering the ground, lightning illuminating the valley in stark flashes. Thunder rolling continuously like artillery fire, Cannon moved with urgent efficiency. He stripped the wet blankets from the children and wrapped them in dry ones from the packs that had been protected by oilcloth. He built a fire using wood he had kept dry in a waterproof bag, coaxing flames to life with hands that shook from cold and exertion. The smoke rose toward a crack in the ceiling, drawn by some natural draft. And soon warmth began to spread through the small space. Esther knelt beside the children.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Rubbing their arms and legs to restore circulation, checking them for injuries. Mercy's lips were blue, and Jonah could not stop shivering, but otherwise they seemed unharmed. She pulled them close to the fire, positioning them where the heat would reach them fastest. "You are safe now," she murmured, though her own teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. "You are safe." Cannon stripped off his own soaked shirt and hung it near the fire to dry, revealing a torso marked with old scars, some from battle, others from accidents or hardships Esther could only imagine. He pulled on a dry shirt from his pack and then turned his attention to Esther. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly. "You will catch your death otherwise. I will turn my back, tend to the horses. Change quickly." He did as he said, moving to the cave entrance where the horses stood, still nervous but calming now that they were out of the storm. Esther changed with trembling fingers, peeling away the sodden dress and undergarments, wringing them out as best she could. She had only one other dress in her pack, a faded blue cotton thing that was nearly as patched as the one she had been wearing, but it was dry, and that was all that mattered. She pulled it on and wrapped herself in a blanket, then called out to Cannon that she was decent. He returned to the fire and began checking their supplies, assessing what had been damaged by the storm. Most of the food was intact, protected by careful packing, but some of the dried meat had gotten wet and would need to be eaten quickly before it spoiled. The ammunition was dry, thank God, and the rifle was undamaged. They had enough to last until they reached Clearwater, assuming they could resume travel tomorrow. But as the afternoon wore on and the storm showed no signs of abating, it became clear they would be spending the night in the cave. The temperature continued to drop as evening approached, and Cannon kept the fire burning high, feeding it constantly to maintain warmth. They ate a cold meal of biscuits and dried fruit, saving the warm food for later when they would need it most. As darkness fell outside, the storm intensified. The wind shifted, driving rain into the cave entrance, forcing them to move deeper inside. Cannon positioned the horses at the mouth, using their bodies as a windbreak, then built the fire up again farther back. The children huddled together under layers of blankets, their eyes wide in the flickering firelight, watching the fury outside with a mixture of fear and awe. "Tell us a story," Jonah said suddenly, his voice small but determined, "to take our minds off the storm." Cannon looked surprised, then thoughtful. He settled back against the cave wall, pulling Mercy onto his lap when she reached for him. "What kind of story?" he asked. "A true one," Jonah replied. "About when you were young." Cannon was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost distant, as if he were reaching back through years to touch memories he usually kept locked away. "When I was about your age," he began, "maybe a year or two older, my father took me on my first hunt. We went high into the mountains, just the two of us, tracking an elk herd that had moved up for the summer. It was meant to be a lesson, a passage from childhood into the responsibilities of a man. He paused, adjusting Mercy's position so she could see his face. We trekked for 3 days, sleeping under the stars, eating what we could forage. My father taught me to read signs in the earth, broken twigs, disturbed stones, the way grass bends when something large passes through. He taught me to be patient, to move with the land rather than against it. And on the 3rd day, we found the herd. Jonah leaned forward, captivated. Did you get one? Cannon nodded slowly. My father had me take the shot. It was a long distance, and I was nervous. My hands shook. But he placed his hand on my shoulder and told me to breathe, to become part of the moment, to let the arrow fly when it was ready. I did as he said, and the arrow flew true. The elk fell quickly, without suffering. His expression grew distant. My father made me approach the animal, made me place my hand on its side and feel its last heartbeat. He told me that every life we take is a sacred thing, that we must honor the sacrifice, waste nothing. Remember always that survival comes at a cost. We butchered the elk there on the mountain, packed the meat carefully, and carried it back to our village. It fed many families that winter. Mercy had fallen asleep in his arms, lulled by the sound of his voice and the warmth of the fire. Cannon adjusted the blanket around her without pausing his story. My father died 2 winters later, killed defending our village from raiders. I was 12. After he was gone, I tried to remember everything he taught me, every lesson, every moment. Those memories are what kept me alive through the years that followed, through war and loss and wandering. They are still what guides me now. Esther watched him as he spoke, seeing the pain that lived behind his eyes, the weight of carrying a culture and a history that the world was trying to erase. She understood that weight, had carried her own version of it since the day she was born into slavery. Different circumstances, different chains, but the same fundamental truth, that some people were deemed less valuable than others. And that survival required a strength most could not imagine. The storm raged through the night, unrelenting. At some point Jonah fell asleep as well, curled up next to Esther. She and Cannon remained awake, taking turns feeding the fire, making sure the children stayed warm. In the small hours before dawn, during one of the quietest moments, Esther spoke. What happened to your wife? When the soldiers came, you said you saw her fall, but you never said if she survived. Cannon's face became a mask of stone. When he answered, his voice was barely audible over the wind. She did not. The smoke took her before the flames could. I found her body near the tree line, our daughter still in her arms. They had died together, trying to run to safety that never came. He swallowed hard. I buried them side by side, wrapped in her favorite blanket. I sang the death songs our people sing, though my voice kept breaking. And then I walked away from that place and never returned. Esther felt tears burn her eyes. How do you bear it? How do you keep going after losing everything? Cannon looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that took her breath away. Not despair, but fierce, burning determination. Because giving up would dishonor their memory. Because every day I continue to live, to help others, to stand against cruelty, is another day their deaths meant something. I cannot bring them back, but I can make sure their legacy is not just ashes and grief. He reached across the fire and took her hand. You understand this, I think. You have survived things that would break most people. You carry your own dead, your own losses. But you keep fighting for your children, keep searching for something better. That is not weakness. That is the strongest thing a person can do. His grip tightened slightly. We are not so different, you and I. We are both survivors of a world that tried to destroy us. And we are both still here, still fighting, still hoping. Esther squeezed his hand back, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped across the fire, drawing strength from each other while the storm howled outside and their children slept peacefully nearby. Two people who had every reason to give up, choosing instead to hold on. To each other and to the fragile hope that tomorrow might be better. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and glistening with water. The sun rose over the mountains in a blaze of gold and pink, illuminating a landscape transformed. The river below had swollen to twice its normal size, rushing and foaming over rocks. The hillsides gleamed with moisture, and every plant seemed to have doubled in color. Greens more vivid, flowers more brilliant, they emerged from the cave stiff and sore but alive. Cannon assessed the trail ahead and determined it would be passable, though they would need to move carefully. They packed up the camp, loaded the horses, and resumed their journey toward Clearwater. The children were quiet but not fearful. Changed somehow by the night in the cave, more resilient, more certain of their ability to survive whatever came. As they crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley beyond, Esther saw it, Clearwater. The settlement spread along both sides of a wide stream, perhaps 30 structures in all, some canvas tents, some log cabins, some built of adobe in the style of the Spanish missions. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could see people moving between the buildings, adults working, children playing. It looked peaceful, welcoming, everything Redstone had not been. Cannon pointed toward the largest structure, a longhouse built of logs with a peaked roof. That is the meeting hall. We will go there first, speak with the council. They will decide if you can stay. He looked at Esther. They will accept you. I am certain of it. But you must speak for yourself. Tell them your story. Show them you are willing to work and contribute. Can you do that? Esther straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. I can. I will. She looked at her children, then back at Cannon. Whatever it takes. We have come too far to fail now. Cannon smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Then let us go meet your new neighbors. They began the descent into the valley, toward Clearwater, toward a future that finally held the promise of something more than mere survival. The sun climbed higher, warming their backs. And for the first time since leaving Texas, Esther felt something she had almost forgotten. Genuine, unqualified hope. They had been in Clearwater for 3 weeks when the riders came. 3 weeks of peace, of work, of slowly learning to believe that safety might actually be possible. The council had welcomed them without hesitation after hearing Esther's story, offering them a small cabin at the edge of the settlement and assigning tasks that matched their abilities. Esther worked in the communal garden and helped with laundry, while Jonah and Mercy attended lessons with the other children, learning to read and write from a former schoolteacher named Margaret who had fled Missouri after her husband was killed for harboring runaways. Cannon had stayed, though Esther knew he had not planned to. He told himself he was just making sure they settled in properly, that he would leave once he was certain they were safe. But days turned into weeks, and still he remained, taking on work as a hunter and scout for the settlement, bringing in game and keeping watch for threats. He built an addition onto Esther's cabin, a small room where he could sleep without intruding on their space. Though most evenings he ended up sitting by their fire, whittling toys for the children or teaching Jonah how to set snares. The settlement had embraced them completely. The people here understood persecution, understood what it meant to be cast out, hunted, deemed less than human. There were Modoc families who had escaped the reservation system, Paiute who had fled forced relocations, Chinese laborers who had survived railroad camps and mining disasters, Black families like Esther's who had discovered that freedom on paper meant little without a place to belong. They had built something rare here, a community based not on shared blood, but shared experience, bonded by the knowledge that they had only each other. Esther found herself laughing again, something she had not done in years. She made friends with a woman named Sarah Chun, whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with 2 sons to raise alone. They worked side by side in the garden, sharing stories, teaching each other recipes from their different cultures. The children thrived, gaining weight, their faces filling out, their eyes losing that haunted look that came from chronic hunger and fear. Mercy had started calling Cannon Papa without anyone teaching her to, and he had not corrected her. But the past is a way of finding people, no matter how far they run. It came on a Tuesday morning, when the sky was clear and the air smelled of pine and wildflowers. Esther was hanging laundry on a line strung between two trees, when she heard the sound of horses approaching fast. She looked up to see dust rising from the southern trail, and her stomach clenched with instinctive dread. 4 riders entered the settlement at a gallop, reining their horses to a hard stop in front of the meeting hall. Even from a distance, Esther recognized the lead rider's posture, the way he sat his saddle with arrogant confidence, the expensive cut of his clothes. Her blood turned to ice. Thomas Whitlow, her former owner's eldest son. The man who had claimed ownership of her children even after emancipation, who had sworn he would hunt her to the ends of the earth rather than let his property escape. She dropped the wet shirt she had been holding and ran toward the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She burst through the door, startling Jonah and Mercy, who were playing with wooden blocks Cannon had carved. "Hide," she said urgently, her voice shaking. "Under the bed now, and do not make a sound no matter what you hear." The children recognized the tone, had heard it before during their flight from Texas. They scrambled under the bed without question. Esther grabbed the hunting knife Cannon kept on the shelf and tucked it into her belt, then stepped back outside. Across the settlement, she saw people gathering, drawn by the commotion. Cannon emerged from the tree line where he had been checking traps, his rifle in his hands, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. He moved toward the meeting hall with long strides, and Esther followed, her legs shaking but her jaw set. Thomas Whitlow had dismounted and stood in the center of the settlement, flanked by 3 hard-looking men who were clearly hired guns. He was 30 years old, well-dressed in a suit that had no business being in the wilderness, his face flushed with what might have been exertion or rage. When he spoke, his voice carried the entitled drawl of old Southern money. "I am looking for stolen property," he announced. "A negress woman, late 20s, traveling with 2 mulatto children. I have legal documents proving ownership and a warrant for their return." An older Modoc man named White Eagle, who served as one of the settlement's council leaders, stepped forward. "There is no property here," he said calmly. "Only free people. And we do not recognize the authority of your documents. This is sovereign land, outside the jurisdiction of your laws." Thomas's face reddened further. "The law reaches everywhere, old man. And I will have what belongs to me. Those children have Whitlow blood in them, which makes them mine regardless of what Lincoln said." Esther pushed through the crowd, forcing herself to face him. "They are not yours," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "They were never yours. The war ended slavery. We are free." Thomas turned toward her, and the look on his face made her skin crawl. It was not just anger but possession, the look of a man who believed some people existed only for his use. "Esther May," he said, his voice dripping false courtesy, "you have led us on quite a chase. Cost me a considerable sum in tracker fees and lost labor. But that ends now. You and the children are coming back to Texas where you belong." "She is not going anywhere." Cannon's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He had positioned himself between Thomas and Esther, his rifle held casually but ready. "You heard White Eagle. You have no authority here. Leave while you still can." Thomas looked Cannon up and down with open contempt. "And what are you supposed to be? Her red savage protector? This does not concern your kind, Indian. This is a matter of property rights and family blood." The settlement had gone completely silent, everyone watching, waiting to see how this would resolve. Esther saw Sarah Chun standing with her sons, saw Margaret the schoolteacher with her hand on a young girl's shoulder, Saw family she had come to know and care about, all of them tense and ready. These were people who had fought before, who had learned that sometimes violence was the only language certain men understood. Thomas made a gesture, and his 3 hired guns moved to flank him, their hands moving to their weapons. "I am going to give you one chance," Thomas said, addressing the whole settlement now. "Turn over the women and children, and we will leave peacefully. Resist, and there will be consequences. I have the full backing of the territorial governor and the United States Army. You savages and mongrels want to test that? Test it." The words came from Esther, surprising even herself. She stepped forward, past Cannon, past White Eagle, until she stood directly in front of Thomas. "You think you can just ride in here and take us? You think these people will let you?" She gestured to the settlement around them. "These are not slaves you can whip into submission. These are not conquered people who will bow their heads. Every person here has survived things you cannot imagine. They have buried children, lost homes, watched their worlds burn. And they rebuilt. They survived. And they will not let you take us." Thomas's face twisted with rage. "You dare speak to me that way? After everything my family gave you? Food, shelter, purpose?" He raised his hand as if to strike her, but Cannon moved faster, slamming the rifle butt into Thomas's chest and sending him staggering backward. "Touch her and die," Cannon said flatly. The hired guns drew their weapons, but before they could fire, the sound of multiple rifles being cocked echoed across the settlement. Esther looked around and saw that nearly every adult in Clearwater had armed themselves. Rifles, shotguns, pistols, even hunting bows. They stood in a loose circle around the confrontation, their faces hard and determined. Sarah Chun held a rifle that looked too big for her frame, but her hands were steady. White Eagle had a shotgun. Margaret the schoolteacher gripped a pistol with both hands. Even some of the older children had armed themselves with whatever they could find. Thomas looked around, his confidence visibly wavering as he realized he was vastly outnumbered and outgunned. "You are making a mistake," he said, his voice losing some of its bluster. "When the army hears about this, they will come. They will burn this place to the ground." White Eagle smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Let them try. We have fought armies before. We have lost everything before. We have nothing left to lose, which makes us very dangerous. You, on the other hand, have everything to lose. Your life, for instance." One of the hired guns, the youngest, slowly raised his hands. "I did not sign on for this," he said. "I was told it would be a simple retrieval. Nobody said anything about fighting a whole town." He holstered his weapon and backed toward his horse. The other 2 looked at each other, then at Thomas, then at the armed settlement, and made the same calculation. They backed away, mounted their horses, and within moments had ridden out of Clearwater, leaving Thomas alone. He stood there, face pale now, realizing his mistake. Cannon stepped closer, his voice low and deadly. "You have a choice now. You can leave and never return, forget you ever knew these people existed. Or you can push this further, and I promise you will not leave this valley alive. What will it be?" Thomas looked at Esther one last time, and she saw the exact moment he realized he had lost. Whatever power he thought he had, whatever authority he believed his name and money granted him, it meant nothing here. He was just one man facing a community that had decided to stand together. Without another word, he turned and walked to his horse, mounted clumsily, and rode away, his back stiff with humiliation. The settlement remained armed and ready until the dust from his horse had completely disappeared, until the sound of hooves had faded into silence. Then, slowly, people began to lower their weapons. Someone laughed, a nervous, relieved sound, and then others joined in. The tension broke like a fever, and suddenly people were embracing, celebrating. The crisis averted without bloodshed. Esther felt her legs give out, and she sank to her knees in the dirt. Cannon was beside her in an instant, his hands on her shoulders. "It is over," he said softly. "He will not come back." Men like that are cowards at heart. They only fight when they think they can win. Esther looked up at him through tears she had not realized were falling. "We are really free," she whispered. "For the first time, we are actually free." That evening, the settlement held a gathering in the meeting hall. It was not quite a celebration, more a reaffirmation of who they were and what they stood for. White Eagle spoke about the importance of protecting each other, of standing together against those who would divide them. Others shared stories of their own escapes, their own narrow survivals, their own reasons for being here. And when it was Esther's turn to speak, she stood with her children beside her and Cannon behind her, and she told her story. She told them about slavery, about being property, about having her children nearly sold away from her. She told them about the long walk west, about Redstone's cruelty, about starving in a shanty while the town looked away. And she told them about Cannon, about a stranger who knelt in the dust and offered help when no one else would, who had risked everything to bring them here, who had become the father her children never had, and the partner she never thought she would find. When she finished, there was not a dry eye in the hall. People came forward to embrace her, to promise their continued protection, to welcome her fully into the community. And later, when the gathering ended and they walked back to their cabin under a sky full of stars, Esther felt something she had never experienced before. Not just safety, not just hope, but belonging. At the cabin, they checked on Jonah and Mercy, who had fallen asleep still clutching the wooden toys Cannon had made them. Esther tucked the blankets around them, kissed their foreheads, and whispered a prayer of thanks to whatever force had brought them through the darkness to this place. Then she stepped outside where Cannon stood looking at the stars. "You saved us," she said quietly. "In every way a person can be saved." Cannon shook his head. "You saved yourselves. I just walked beside you." But Esther moved closer, taking his hand. "You are part of this family now. You know that, right? Those children in there, they are yours as much as mine. And she paused, gathering courage. "I want you to stay. Not just for them, but for me. If you want to." Cannon looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting starlight. Then he smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his face. "I want to stay," he said. "I think I have wanted to stay since the moment I knelt in that dust and saw you and your children. I just did not know if I deserved to." Esther reached up and touched his face. "You deserve every good thing this world has to offer. And if you will have us, we would like to be one of those good things." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. And they stood like that for a long time, two people who had survived hell finding peace in each other's embrace. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering but witness to human resilience. In the cabin behind them, two children slept peacefully, dreaming of a future that finally looked bright. And in the settlement around them, a community of survivors rested, knowing they had stood together and won. The next morning, Cannon began building a permanent addition to the cabin, turning his temporary room into something meant to last. Esther started a new garden plot, planting seeds Sarah had given her, vegetables that would feed them through the coming winter. Jonah and Mercy returned to their lessons, chattering excitedly about everything they were learning. Life in Clearwater continued. Ordinary and precious, sometimes at night. Esther would wake and lie in the darkness, listening to her children breathe, to Cannon's steady presence in the next room, to the peaceful sounds of the settlement around them. And she would remember the shanty in Redstone, the desperate hunger, the moment she whispered for help not knowing if anyone would hear. She would remember Cannon kneeling in the dust, offering his hand, changing everything. They had traveled so far, through storm and danger and confrontation, from slavery to freedom, from despair to hope, from strangers to family. The journey had nearly broken them, but it had not. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger, something that could weather whatever came next. Because they had learned the most important lesson of all, that survival was not just about enduring, but about finding people worth surviving for, worth fighting for, worth building a life with. And so in a small settlement in the California foothills, in a place the world had forgotten, a new family grew. Not born of blood, but of choice. Not bound by law, but by love. A mother who had been property became a free woman. Children who had known only hunger learned what it meant to be full. And a man who thought he had nothing left to give discovered he had everything that mattered. The story that began with desperate words whispered in dust ended with a home built on solid ground. With laughter echoing through rooms that smelled of fresh bread, with children growing strong and safe, with two people who had saved each other, learning what it meant to truly live. From hunger came abundance, from fear came courage, and from the kindness of a stranger came something that would last generations. Years later, when Jonah and Mercy were grown with children of their own, they would tell the story of how their family began. They would speak of a man who knelt in the dust and said 5 words that changed everything. "I will feed you all." And they would teach their children the lesson Canon and Esther had learned through fire and trial, that the measure of a person is not in what they take, but in what they give. Not in who they dominate, but in who they protect. Not in the power they wield, but in the mercy they show. And in Clearwater, that lesson lived on, passed down through generations. A reminder that even in the darkest times, even when all seems lost, there are still those who will kneel in the dust and offer their hand. Still those who will say, "Come with me. You will never go hungry again." And mean it. The morning sun broke over the eastern ridge, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. Esther stood at the window of the cabin, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching the settlement wake to another day. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals. Children's voices carried on the breeze as they hurried toward the schoolhouse. And somewhere nearby, a rooster announced the dawn with stubborn persistence. It was a scene so ordinary, so peaceful, that sometimes she still had to remind herself it was real. 1 year had passed since they arrived in Clearwater. 1 year since Thomas Whitlow rode away in defeat. 1 year since everything changed. The cabin had grown significantly in that time. What had started as a simple structure now boasted 3 proper rooms, a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and a root cellar dug deep enough to keep vegetables fresh through the winter. Canon had built most of it with his own hands, though nearly every man in the settlement had contributed time and labor, the way neighbors did when someone needed help. The garden Esther had planted that first spring had flourished beyond her wildest expectations. Rows of corn stood taller than Jonah now, their tassels golden in the morning light. Tomato plants heavy with fruit leaned against wooden stakes. Squash vines sprawled across the ground, their broad leaves hiding treasure underneath. She had learned to preserve food the way Sarah Chun taught her, canning vegetables in glass jars, drying herbs and meat, storing enough to feed them through the lean months. The shelves in the root cellar were lined with her work, proof that they would not go hungry again. Behind her, she heard movement in the bedroom. Canon emerged, his hair loose around his shoulders, still wearing the simple cotton shirt and trousers he slept in. He moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You are up early," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. Esther smiled without taking her eyes from the view. "I like watching the day begin. It reminds me how far we have come." Canon wrapped an arm around her waist and pulled her closer. They stood like that for a while, comfortable in the silence that had become their own language. There was no need to fill every moment with words. They had learned to communicate in gestures, in the way they moved around each other, in the countless small acts of consideration that made up a shared life. He kissed the top of her head before moving to stoke the fire in the kitchen stove. beginning the morning ritual of preparing breakfast. The children would wake soon, as they always did, drawn by the smell of food and the promise of a new day. But for now, these quiet moments belonged to Esther and Cannon alone. She watched him work, measuring cornmeal for Johnny cakes, slicing salt pork for the pan, moving with the confidence of someone who had found his place. He no longer carried the haunted look he had worn when they first met, that shadow of loss and guilt that had followed him like a second skin. Time and love had not erased his scars, but they had given him permission to be more than his grief. 4 months ago, in a ceremony presided over by White Eagle and witnessed by the entire settlement, Esther and Cannon had married. It was not legal by the laws of the territory, interracial marriage being forbidden, but it was recognized by everyone who mattered. They had exchanged vows under an oak tree at sunset, Jonah and Mercy standing between them, their small hands joined with their parents in a circle that represented the family they had become. Sarah Chun had woven flowers into Esther's hair, and White Eagle had blessed them in Modoc and English both, asking the spirits of earth and sky to protect their union. The wedding feast had lasted until dawn, the entire settlement contributing food and music and joy. Someone produced a fiddle, and they danced in the firelight, old dances and new, black spirituals blending with Modoc songs and Chinese melodies. Esther had never felt so completely embraced by a community, so utterly accepted for exactly who she was. When Cannon had lifted her in his arms to carry her across the threshold of their cabin, the cheers had echoed across the valley. Now, watching him cook breakfast in the soft morning light, she felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. This life they had built, this family, this home, it was everything she had dreamed of during those dark days in Redstone when survival seemed impossible. Not just survival, but joy. Not just shelter, but belonging. Not just safety, but love. Mama? The small voice came from the doorway. Mercy stood there in her nightgown, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair wild around her face. At 6 years old, she had grown tall and strong, her face fuller, her smile quicker. The haunted thinness was gone, replaced by the healthy glow of a well-fed, well-loved child. "I smell breakfast," she announced unnecessarily, patting across the floor to wrap her arms around Esther's waist. "Good morning, little bird," Esther said, using the nickname Cannon had given Mercy after she developed a habit of singing constantly while she worked or played. "Did you sleep well?" Mercy nodded and moved to Cannon, who lifted her onto his hip with one arm while continuing to flip Johnny cakes with the other. "Papa, can we go to the creek today? Sarah's boys said they saw a beaver building a dam, and I want to see it." "We will see," Cannon replied, which was his standard answer to most requests. "First, chores. Then breakfast. Then school. If you finish your lessons early and help your mother with the garden, perhaps we can walk to the creek before supper." Mercy accepted this with the easy grace of a child who understood that everything had its time and place, that adults made promises they kept. That patience was rewarded. Jonah emerged moments later, taller than his sister by half a head, his face taking on the angular features of approaching adolescence. At 7, he was serious and thoughtful, always watching, always learning. He had become Cannon's shadow, following him everywhere when allowed, absorbing every lesson about tracking, hunting, survival. But he was also gentle with his sister, protective of his mother, quick to help anyone who needed it. The settlement elders said he would be a leader someday, someone people would follow naturally. "Morning," he mumbled, sliding into his chair at the table. He had recently decided he was too old for excessive displays of affection. Though Esther noticed he still sought out hugs when he thought no one was watching. "Did you check the snares yet, Papa?" Cannon shook his head. "Not yet. I thought you might want to come with me after breakfast. We can check them together, and I will show you how to reset the triggers." "You are ready to learn that now." Jonah's face lit up. though he tried to hide his excitement with a casual shrug. I guess that would be okay. Esther hid a smile as she helped set the table, placing wooden plates and cups, filling a pitcher with water from the barrel by the door. These morning routines, the ordinariness of them, still filled her with wonder. Once, she had been property without agency, without choice, without the right to sit at her own table and eat with her own family. Now she was wife, mother, homeowner, citizen of a community that valued her. The transformation still felt miraculous. They ate together, talking about the day ahead. Mercy chattered about school, about learning to write her letters more neatly, about how Marcus Chun had put a frog in Abigail's lunch pail and gotten in trouble. Jonah talked about the book he was reading, an adventure story about sailors that Margaret had loaned him from her small library. Cannon mentioned he needed to ride out to the northern boundary to check on the warning cairns they maintained, stone markers that would alert them if anyone approached the settlement. Esther discussed her plans to help Sarah with soap making, using lye and fat they had been saving. After breakfast, Cannon and Jonah headed out to check the snares, while Esther helped Mercy dress for school and braided her hair, weaving in a strip of red ribbon Sarah had given her. "You look beautiful," Esther told her daughter, kissing her forehead. "Now go on, or you will be late. And remember what we talked about. Pay attention to Miss Margaret, do your work carefully, and be kind to the other children." Mercy grabbed the small lunch pail Esther had packed and ran out the door, her voice already raised in song as she hurried down the path toward the schoolhouse. Esther watched her go, marveling at her daughter's resilience, her capacity for joy despite everything she had experienced in her short life. Children were remarkable that way, able to heal and grow and find happiness even after trauma, especially when given safety and love. With the children occupied, Esther turned to the day's work. She changed into her gardening clothes and headed outside, where the morning sun was already warming the earth. The garden required constant attention, weeding, watering, checking for pests, harvesting what was ready. She worked methodically, her hands moving through familiar tasks. Her mind free to wander, she thought about Thomas Whitlow sometimes, wondering if he had kept his word and stayed away, or if he was plotting some new attempt to reclaim what he believed was his. White Eagle had sent scouts periodically to watch the southern approaches, but in a year there had been no sign of him or anyone connected to him. Perhaps he really had given up. Perhaps he had finally accepted that some things, once lost, could not be recovered. More likely, she suspected, he simply did not want to risk his life for pride. Men like Thomas were bullies, dangerous when they had power but cowards when facing real opposition. The settlement had shown him they would fight, and he had decided they were not worth the cost. Either way, she was grateful. Every day that passed without threat was a gift. Another day her children could grow up free. Around mid-morning, Sarah arrived with her sons, Marcus and Daniel, who immediately ran off to find their own adventures while the women worked. Sarah was 35, small and wiry, with quick hands and a quicker mind. She had survived the Taiping Rebellion as a child, crossed the ocean to work in California, endured her husband's death in a mining accident, and emerged with her spirit intact and her faith in humanity somehow unshaken. She and Esther had become inseparable friends, sisters in all but blood. They worked side by side, rendering fat and mixing lye, stirring the soap mixture in a large iron pot over an outdoor fire. It was hot, unpleasant work, but necessary, and the time passed quickly in conversation. They talked about everything and nothing. Their children's progress in school, the upcoming harvest festival, the new family that had arrived last week, a Mexican couple fleeing persecution in a mining town to the south. "You seem happy," Sarah observed at one point, studying Esther's face. "Truly happy, not just content." "It is good to see," Esther smiled, stirring the soap. "I am. I wake up some mornings and cannot believe this is my life. that I get to choose how to spend my days, that my children are safe, that I have a husband who loves me and a home that is actually mine. It feels like a dream. Sarah nodded, understanding. I felt that way after Wei died, when I thought I would lose everything. But then this place took us in, and I realized that family is not just blood. It is the people who stand with you when the world tries to knock you down. She paused. Cannon is a good man. You are fortunate to have found each other. Esther agreed. He saved us, but I think maybe we saved him too. He was so lost when we met, carrying so much grief. Now he has purpose again, reason to wake up each morning. We gave him that, the way he gave us safety. The soap making took most of the day. By the time they finished, they had produced enough bars to last both families through winter, with extra to trade at the festival. They cleaned up the work area, banking the fire and storing the soap in a cool shed to cure. Sarah's boys appeared as if summoned by some internal clock, ready for the lunch their mother had brought. They sat together under a tree, sharing food and water, resting in companionable silence. Later that afternoon, after Sarah had left and Esther had completed her other chores, she walked to the schoolhouse to collect Mercy. The building was small but well built, with real glass windows and a wood stove for cold weather. Through the open door, she could hear Margaret's voice reading aloud, her students following along. When the lesson ended and the children poured out, Mercy ran to Esther with a slate on which she had written her name in careful letters. "Look, Mama. Miss Margaret said my penmanship is improving." The pride in her voice made Esther's heart swell. "It is beautiful, sweetheart. I am so proud of you." They walked home hand in hand, Mercy talking nonstop about her day. Some older boys had teased her about her dark skin, but she had ignored them the way Esther taught her, refusing to let their ignorance wound her. "Besides," Mercy said matter-of-factly, "Marcus told them to shut up or he would put spiders in their beds. And they left me alone after that, at home." They found Cannon and Jonah had returned from their expedition. 3 rabbits hung from a line near the porch, already skinned and ready for cooking. Jonah was practicing knots with a piece of rope, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Cannon was repairing a harness, his hands working the leather with practiced skill. It was a scene of domestic peace that Esther never tired of witnessing. That evening, after supper, they walked to the creek as promised. The beaver dam was impressive, a construction of branches and mud that had backed up the water into a small pond. They sat on the bank and watched the beavers work, industrious and focused, building their home one branch at a time. "They are like us," Jonah observed quietly. "Building something safe." Cannon ruffled his hair. "Exactly like us." As the sun set and the sky turned purple and gold, they walked back to the cabin together, the 4 of them. Mercy rode on Cannon's shoulders, singing softly. Jonah walked between Esther and Cannon, holding both their hands. And Esther felt a completeness she had never known before. A sense of rightness that went beyond mere happiness into something deeper and more enduring. That night, after the children were asleep, Esther and Cannon sat on the porch as they often did, watching the stars emerge one by one. The settlement was quiet, lights flickering in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. Somewhere a baby cried, then settled. A dog barked once, then silence. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been if we had never met?" Esther asked. "If you had walked past us in Redstone that day." Cannon was quiet for a long time. "I think I would have kept wandering until the wandering killed me. I had no anchor, no reason to stay anywhere. I was just moving through the world without purpose." He took her hand. "You and the children gave me back my life. You gave me a reason to stop running from my grief and start living again. So no, I do not think about what my life would have been. I only think about what it is now and how grateful I am for it." Esther leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was so afraid when I whispered for help that day. I thought no one would hear Or if they did, they would not care. I had given up believing in kindness. She squeezed his hand. You restored my faith in humanity. You showed my children that there are still good people in this world, people who help because it is right, not because there is something to gain. That is a gift I can never repay. You do not owe me anything, Cannon said firmly. Love is not a debt. It is freely given, or it is not love at all. He pulled her closer. We have all given each other something precious. You gave me purpose. I gave you safety. Together we gave our children a future. That is not debt, that is family. They sat like that until the stars filled the sky from horizon to horizon. A vast canopy of light that had witnessed every human story. Every triumph and tragedy, every act of cruelty and kindness. Somewhere out in the darkness, coyotes sang their wild songs. The creek murmured its endless melody. The wind whispered through the pines. And in a small cabin in a forgotten valley, a family created from loss and love and choice rested, secure in the knowledge that they had found what everyone seeks. A place to belong, people to love, a reason to wake up each morning with hope. The journey that began with desperate words whispered in dust had led them here, to this life, to this moment. From slavery to freedom, from hunger to abundance, from strangers to family, they had traveled a road marked by hardship and grace in equal measure. And though they knew that life would bring new challenges, new sorrows, new trials, they also knew they would face them together, bound by something stronger than law or blood or circumstance. 1 year had passed since Cannon knelt in the dust and said 5 words that changed everything. 1 year of growth, of healing, of building a life that honored both the dead they carried and the living they protected. 1 year of proving that mercy was not weakness, that kindness could survive even in the hardest soil, that love could triumph over a world designed to crush it. And as the night deepened and the stars wheeled in their ancient dance, Esther whispered a prayer of gratitude for the stranger who became a savior, the savior who became a partner, the partner who became family. For the man who taught her children that courage meant standing up for those who could not stand for themselves. That strength meant using power to protect rather than dominate. That true freedom came not just from broken chains, but from hearts willing to choose compassion over cruelty. In the morning, they would wake and begin again. There would be work to do, lessons to teach, challenges to face. But they would face them together, as they always did now, a family forged in fire and bound by love. And that, Esther thought as sleep finally claimed her, was more than she had ever dared to dream possible. It was everything.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.